You won't believe me, but my dad works at the Pentagon, Jimmy said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the classroom like a knife through silence. The words hung in the air for a heartbeat, too surreal to process at first. The students around him froze for a moment, then burst into laughter. It was an eruption of mockery, laughter that spread like wildfire across the room. The sort of laughter that you can only get when someone says something so outlandish, so unbelievable, that it challenges the very fabric of reality. Sure, Jimmy. A voice called from the back of the room, dripping with sarcasm, and I'm best friends with the president. The laughter intensified, a few students shaking their heads in disbelief. Jimmy had always been the type of kid to say things that didn't quite match up with the reality most people lived in. He was a dreamer, always dreaming up big ideas, wild scenarios, and fantastic stories that more often than not sounded more like something out of a movie than actual life. And this time, it seemed no different. But Jimmy wasn't backing down. He didn't falter in the face of the jeers. He just sat there, straightening his shoulders and locking eyes with his classmates. He had heard it all before, the jokes, the teasing, the rolled eyes, but this time it felt different. He wasn't just saying it to get attention. This time his words carried weight. They meant something. I'm serious, he said louder now. My dad works at the Pentagon. He's a high-ranking officer there. The classroom quieted slightly, but not enough to stop the quiet snickers from continuing. Even Mr. Johnson, the history teacher, who usually had the patience of a saint, glanced over at Jimmy, a look of skepticism on his face. It was clear that the teacher didn't quite believe him, either. Jimmy, after all, had a reputation for telling stories that stretched the truth beyond recognition. So, naturally, no one was ready to believe that Jimmy's dad, an ordinary guy to everyone else, was really part of something as significant as the Pentagon. The clock on the wall ticked on, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the classroom. Time seemed to stretch as Jimmy sat there, his words still hanging in the air. There was a tight knot in his stomach, a feeling that his claim, something so wild, so unbelievable, wasn't going to be taken seriously. He could already feel the eyes of his classmates on him, some amused, others annoyed, and most just confused. But there was something in his chest that told him to stay calm, to hold his ground. He wasn't lying. His father worked at the Pentagon, and yet all the laughter around him only made it harder to make them understand that. Yeah, right, another student chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And next, you're going to tell us you've been to Mars. The room erupted again with laughter. This was just another joke to them, just another outlandish story from Jimmy. But in that moment, Jimmy didn't care. He knew his dad's work was important, and he knew that one day, people would realize he wasn't just making things up. He couldn't change their minds right then, but he wasn't going to back down. I'm not joking, Jimmy said, his voice quieter this time, but more intense. My dad works at the Pentagon. He's a high-ranking officer there, and he does really important work. He's not some ordinary guy. The students paused. Some of the laughter subsided, but the skeptical expressions didn't. It was as if no one was willing to let Jimmy's words sink in. They all looked at him like he was a character from a storybook, a character who lived in a world so far removed from their own reality that it didn't even seem worth entertaining. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Jimmy gathered his things slowly, his eyes scanning the room for a sign of belief, for even a hint of recognition. But there was nothing, no nod of acknowledgement, no sign that anyone took him seriously. He could feel the weight of their disbelief pressing on him, but he wasn't going to let it get to him. Not this time. With his bag slung over his shoulder, Jimmy stood up and walked out of the classroom. He held his head high, despite the laughter still echoing in his ears. He could hear it all, the whispers, the chuckles, but he didn't let it affect him. He had made his statement, and the truth of it would come out sooner or later. The hallway was quieter, the noise of the classroom fading into the background as he walked towards his next class. But as he passed by his locker, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The eyes of his classmates, still on him from behind the doors of the classroom, seemed to follow him like shadows. He could hear the faint murmur of voices discussing him, speculating about whether he was lying or just dreaming again. But Jimmy knew the truth. His dad did work at the Pentagon. Jimmy knew it deep down in his bones. His father had told him so many times about the work he did, the late nights, the responsibility. It was real. It was more real than anything anyone else in that class could understand. And even though the laughter had stung, even though the disbelief had hurt, Jimmy knew that one day they would all realize that his claim was more than just another story. It was the truth. As he entered his next class, Jimmy pushed the thoughts aside and tried to focus. But a part of him couldn't help but wonder, what if they never believed him? What if he spent his whole life trying to prove something that was too unbelievable for anyone to accept? He didn't have the answers yet. But one thing was for sure, he wasn't going to stop telling the truth, even if no one else could see it. And with that thought, he settled into his seat, waiting for the day when the truth would finally speak for itself. The next morning, Jimmy walked into his history class with a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. The laughter from the day before still echoed in his mind, but there was something different today. It wasn't just the usual anxiety. There was a weight to the air, an undeniable shift. He couldn't explain it, but the eyes of his classmates seemed to follow him everywhere he went. Some of them avoided looking at him altogether, while others watched him with a curious intensity as though they were waiting for something to happen. Jimmy sat in his usual spot near the back of the room. He didn't speak to anyone, his thoughts swirling. His fingers tapped nervously on the edge of his desk as he wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe he should have just kept quiet. After all, no one had believed him. No one had even given him a second thought. But then again, maybe they were right to laugh. Maybe it was just another wild story from Jimmy, the dreamer. The door opened, and Mr. Johnson walked in, carrying a manila envelope. He seemed unusually calm today, his face unreadable. He placed the envelope on his desk and turned to the class with a serious expression. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Johnson said, his voice steady but carrying an unusual weight. "We have a special guest today." The class went quiet, everyone's attention immediately drawn to Mr. Johnson. A guest? Jimmy wondered what was going on. He looked around, catching the curious expressions of his classmates. They were all wondering the same thing. Who was the guest, and why was he here? Mr. Johnson looked over at Jimmy, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than usual. Then he spoke again. "Everyone, please welcome General Thomas Reed." Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't place it. The class was completely still now, everyone's eyes on the door. And then it swung open. A man walked in, tall and commanding. He wore a perfectly pressed military uniform, the kind that could only belong to someone important. His presence immediately filled the room, as if he had stepped straight out of a scene from a movie. His uniform was decorated with stripes and badges, a clear indication of his rank. The students were silent, staring at him with wide eyes, and then the realization hit. This wasn't just any man. This was someone powerful. Someone who didn't just belong in their classroom. The general's eyes scanned a room before they landed on Jimmy. It felt like time slowed down as the general's gaze locked with his. Jimmy's palms suddenly felt clammy and his throat went dry. He had no idea what was happening. The moment felt surreal, like a dream he would wake up from any second. "General Reed," Mr. Johnson said, his voice reverberating through the room, "would you like to introduce yourself?" The general nodded slightly and took a step forward, his demeanor calm but firm. "Good morning, everyone," General Reed said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I'm General Thomas Reed. I've had the honor of working at the Pentagon for over 2 decades. I'm here today because of a young man in this room, Jimmy." A stunned silence followed his words. No one moved. No one even breathed. It was as if the whole room had frozen in place. Jimmy's mind raced, trying to process the meaning of what he had just heard. The laughter from the previous day, the doubt, the teasing, it was all gone. In its place was a silence so thick you could cut it with a knife. General Reed's eyes softened slightly as he looked down at Jimmy, who was now completely speechless. His hands were trembling, and his heart was pounding in his chest. You see, General Reed continued, Jimmy is not just a student in this class. He's my son. The words echoed in the room, and for a long moment no one spoke. It was as if the entire class was trying to absorb the information they had just been given. Jimmy's classmates stared at him, their eyes wide with disbelief. How could this be possible? The boy who had been laughed at just yesterday was now the son of a high-ranking officer at the Pentagon? Jimmy felt his face flush as all eyes turned to him. He wanted to sink into the ground and disappear. How could this be real? Was this a dream? But as he looked at the general, standing tall and proud, the truth hit him with full force. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a game. It was real. I've been very proud of my son, General Reed continued, his voice now a little softer. He's a remarkable young man, and I'm honored to be here today. The class sat in stunned silence. Every single one of them was processing what had just happened. The laughter from the day before seemed like a distant memory now, replaced with a sense of awe and respect. Jimmy's reputation had changed in an instant. The doubts, the mockery, the teasing, it was all gone. For the next hour, General Reed spoke to the class about his experiences at the Pentagon. He spoke about his work, the challenges he faced, and the responsibilities that came with serving his country. He talked about the importance of integrity, hard work, and making a difference in the world. The students were captivated, hanging on to every word he said. Jimmy listened intently, his chest swelling with pride. His father, the man who had always been his hero, was speaking to the class in a way that left everyone in awe. Jimmy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he watched his father standing before the class, teaching them the values that had shaped his life. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, General Reed turned to Jimmy with a warm smile. The pride in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm proud of you, son," he said quietly. Jimmy beamed, his heart soaring. The students around him whispered amongst themselves, their expressions filled with admiration. The same classmates who had laughed at him the day before were now looking at him with respect. From that moment on, Jimmy was no longer the boy with wild stories. He was the son of a general, and he would never be underestimated again. As the class filed out, the whispers in the hallways were no longer mocking. They were filled with admiration and awe. Jimmy's life had changed in a single moment, and he knew that from now on, things would never be the same. But the story doesn't end here. Sometimes life throws us challenges, and it takes a surprising turn to remind us of our worth. So, to all of you out there who feel misunderstood or overlooked, remember this. The truth has a way of revealing itself when we least expect it. Keep your head high, and don't let anyone define your story. This was just one chapter of Jimmy's journey. To hear more inspiring stories like this, stay tuned with Expect Stories, where every twist and turn in life matters.